The M4A1 did not become the default American carbine because it was the most dramatic object in the room. It became default for a less romantic reason: it fit the institution at the moment. The institution needed something smaller, familiar, adaptable, and repeatable. That is the real story. Not a fantasy about one perfect weapon, and not a catalogue of parts. The M4A1 matters because it shows how a military can move from specialized carbine to normal service tool without admitting that the definition of normal has changed. For decades, a shorter rifle could look like a compromise. In the old imagination, length meant authority, velocity, distance, and seriousness. A carbine was what you gave to people who needed convenience more than purity: vehicle crews, officers, support personnel, special units, anyone whose main job was not the clean image of the rifleman standing in open ground. Then the battlefield kept crowding the soldier. Vehicles became central. Body armor, radios, optics, night equipment, and specialist gear grew around the individual. Urban fighting and close movement made length feel less like dignity and more like friction. A weapon that was slightly less ideal in one traditional measure could become better for the day-to-day reality of carrying, moving, entering, exiting, communicating, and surviving inside a modern force. That is the first point. The M4A1 pays off quickly. The carbine did not win by being small. It won because smallness solved institutional problems that had become impossible to ignore. Those problems were not dramatic in isolation. A few inches inside a vehicle. A little less awkwardness around a doorway. A weapon that sat more naturally with armor, radios, and other equipment. None of that sounds like a revolution when separated into small claims. Together, they changed the everyday experience of the soldier. The M4A1's rise was built from that accumulation of ordinary friction. The same logic applies to training. A shorter weapon does not automatically make a soldier more effective, and the carbine did not erase the need for discipline, maintenance, or judgment. But a weapon that is easier to carry through more of the day creates fewer small fights against the user's environment. Those small fights matter because they happen constantly. A military can ignore one complaint. It cannot ignore a pattern that repeats across vehicles, compounds, patrols, storage racks, aircraft, and training ranges. The M4A1 sat inside a family the military already understood. That mattered. Armies do not like changing every variable at once. A carbine linked to the broader AR-15 and M16 lineage offered a familiar manual of arms, a familiar training ecosystem, a familiar ammunition supply, and a familiar maintenance culture. A completely foreign solution might have solved one problem while creating 10 new frictions. The M4A1 solved enough without asking the institution to become someone else overnight. This is why default is such an important word. Default does not mean perfect. It means the thing that works across enough roles, bases, units, budgets, and training pipelines that the institution stops thinking of it as unusual. The M4A1 became a kind of infrastructure. Once a weapon becomes infrastructure, the debate changes. People no longer ask only whether it is best in a pure technical contest. They ask what it would cost to move away from it. If you like weapons history that treats adoption as a serious institutional story, subscribe after this point. The channel is built around the reasons armies choose, keep, and normalize equipment, not around tactical advice or shopping lists. The M4A1 also changed the way people thought about modularity, but we need to keep that word at the right altitude. This is not about recommending accessories or configurations. Historically, modularity meant the carbine could adapt to different institutional needs without requiring a new rifle for every role. Optics, aiming devices, rails, and mission equipment became part of the larger story, but the deeper issue was flexibility inside a huge organization. That flexibility had a cultural effect as well. Earlier service rifle debates often treated the weapon as a fixed identity. The M4A1 belonged to a period when the rifle was increasingly understood as a host for a broader package. The institution was not only asking what the carbine was on its own. It was asking what it could support across units, missions, and modernization cycles. That shift helped turn a compact weapon into a long-term platform. That platform logic changed the replacement question. If the carbine can receive new sights, new training emphasis, new maintenance attention and new doctrine without changing its basic institutional identity, then it becomes easier to keep improving around it than to replace it outright. The system accumulates upgrades, habits and expectations. At that point, a rival design has to compete not only with the weapon, but with years of institutional comfort. That flexibility had a price. Every added option creates training questions, supply questions, durability questions, and standardization questions. A platform that can accept many things can also become a platform that demands constant management. The M4A1's success was not that it made complexity disappear. Its success was that the military judged the complexity manageable because the base system was already familiar. This is where many online arguments miss the point. They compare weapons as if armies select objects one at a time in a clean room. Real militaries adopt ecosystems. A rifle is surrounded by armorers, instructors, depots, ammunition contracts, qualification standards, spare parts, doctrine, imagery, and habit. The M4A1's advantage was not isolated from that ecosystem. It was the ecosystem. The carbine's rise also reflected the changing image of the American soldier. In the Second World War imagination, the rifleman can be pictured with a long rifle and a clear role. In the late 20th and early 21st century imagination, the soldier is more often inside a vehicle, moving through buildings, carrying electronic gear, operating in mixed teams and working under a much heavier personal load. A shorter weapon did not merely save inches. It fit a new physical reality. That is why the phrase "deadliest service rifle" can be misleading unless we translate it. The M4A1's historical power was not some mystical lethality. It was distribution. It appeared everywhere because the institution made it normal. Once an object becomes common across training, deployment, photography, and memory, its cultural reputation grows after the fact. People mistake ubiquity for inevitability. But ubiquity was earned through boring decisions. The boring decisions are often the important ones. A procurement officer does not get applause for reducing friction. A training command does not become famous for preserving continuity. A logistics system does not make a dramatic image by keeping parts moving. Yet these are exactly the forces that turn a carbine into a standard. The M4A1 was successful because it was not only a weapon, it was an answer to movement, storage, transport, training, and institutional memory. That is also why the carbine's reputation can be hard to discuss honestly. People who carried it in service may remember very specific frustrations or loyalties. Viewers who mostly know it from media may see an icon. Engineers may focus on trade-offs. Historians may focus on adoption. All of those views touch something real, but none of them alone explains why the system became so widespread. There was still a contradiction at the center. A shorter carbine asks for trade-offs. It is not magic. Compared with longer rifles in the same family, it raises questions of performance envelope, wear, expectation, and role. But militaries often accept a trade-off when the total package makes daily life easier across many contexts. The M4A1 was not a pure expression of one ideal. It was a negotiated settlement. That negotiated quality is easy to underrate. Enthusiasts often want a winner to be clean, the best range, the best reliability, the best ergonomics, the best everything. Institutions usually want something messier, good enough in many places, familiar enough to train, compact enough to carry, adaptable enough to justify, and politically acceptable enough to fund. The M4A1 is a classic example of a system winning by being broadly tolerable rather than theoretically pure. If you think the word default is too generous or not generous enough, put the case in the comments. The useful question is not favorite or overrated. It is, what did the M4A1 solve for the institution that a longer rifle no longer sold as cleanly? The special operations connection also matters, but not in the way internet culture often treats it. Elite adoption can accelerate reputation, but it does not automatically prove universal superiority. Special units may have different budgets, different training time, different mission sets and different tolerance for complexity. The M4A1's broader success came when the logic moved beyond niche use and became persuasive for conventional forces as well. That movement required a change in what conventional meant. The distinction between the specialist's environment and the regular soldier's environment narrowed in visible ways. More troops worked from vehicles. More troops carried electronic equipment. More troops operated in villages, compounds, streets, and buildings rather than in the simplified open field picture that older rifle arguments sometimes assume. The carbine did not make those changes happen. It benefited from them. That movement from niche to normal is the heart of the video. A tool first justified by special circumstances becomes easier to defend as the ordinary circumstances start to look more like the special ones. Vehicles, confined spaces, heavy equipment, communications gear, and rapid movement were not rare exceptions anymore. They became part of the normal battlefield grammar. The carbine followed that grammar. The cultural reputation came later. Once the M4A1 filled news footage, training ranges, photographs, films, games, and veteran memory, it became difficult to see it as a procurement answer. It became an icon. Icons flatten history. They make the object appear destined. But the path to default status was full of trade-offs, complaints, incremental changes, and institutional compromise. One of the most interesting parts of the M4A1 story is that it sits between conservatism and adaptation. It did not ask the army to abandon the AR family. It did not ask soldiers to learn a totally alien platform. But it did quietly admit that the long rifle ideal no longer owned the center of gravity. The institution could change the form while keeping enough continuity to make the change acceptable. That is a very powerful procurement pattern. Radical change often fails because it threatens too many habits at once. Small change can fail because it does not solve enough. The M4A1 found the middle lane, visibly different in use and role, but institutionally familiar. It was a change that could be explained without sounding like a revolution. The lesson is not that every army should choose a carbine for every problem. That would be the same mistake in reverse. The lesson is that weapon adoption follows the shape of the war an institution expects to fight and the burdens it expects soldiers to carry. When those burdens change, the definition of an acceptable rifle changes with them. The M4A1 also shows how a weapon can become a compromise that no longer feels like one. Early critics can point to the ways a shorter barrel changes expectations. Traditionalists can ask what was lost. Users can complain about maintenance, wear, or performance in specific conditions. But if the daily advantages are present often enough, the compromise becomes ordinary. The institution stops feeling that it is giving something up and starts feeling that the older alternative is inconvenient. If this distinction helped, tap like as a signal for more history that treats familiar weapons as institutional evidence rather than fan objects. By the end, the M4A1's importance is not that it was flawless. It was not. Its importance is that it made a compact service carbine feel normal across a military that once treated that category as secondary. It turned a compromise into a standard because the battlefield made the compromise useful. That is how default happens. Not through one perfect technical victory, but through accumulation, one unit, one deployment, one training pipeline, one logistics argument, one modernization step, one photograph at a time. Eventually the carbine stops looking like a deviation and starts looking like the baseline. The M4A1 became that baseline because it matched the institution's changing body. The soldier had more to carry, more places to move through, more systems to interact with, and less patience for a weapon optimized for an older picture of war. The carbine did not erase trade-offs. It simply made the old trade-offs less persuasive than the new ones. This is why the M4A1 is a better subject than a simple ranking video. It lets us see the American military adjusting its assumptions without fully abandoning its lineage. It kept the family resemblance, kept the training bridge, kept the logistics conversation manageable, and still moved the service rifle ideal toward compactness. That is not a clean revolution. It is exactly how large institutions usually change. The final image is not a perfect carbine defeating every rival in a clean contest. It is a default spreading because the old default no longer fit the body of the force. The M4A1 became normal by solving enough unromantic problems at once: space, familiarity, modular growth, training continuity, and the practical burden of a modern soldier. That is a deeper victory than looking impressive on a specification sheet. It also explains why the story still produces debate. A default weapon becomes everyone's reference point, so every weakness feels personal, and every strength feels obvious. But history should not confuse familiarity with inevitability. The M4A1 had to become normal through a chain of institutional choices, and those choices only make sense when you see the force around the carbine: vehicles, armor, radios, optics, training, logistics, and a battlefield that kept making compactness less optional. That is the cleanest final judgment. The M4A1 did not end the service rifle argument. It changed the center of that argument. It made compactness ordinary, and once that happens, the old standard has to justify why it should still be large. That is how a carbine becomes default without ever needing to be perfect. It becomes the shape of ordinary service. In that sense, the M4A1 is not just a famous American weapon. It is a case study in how normal changes. What begins as a specialized answer becomes a default when the environment quietly becomes specialized too.